Hello everyone, welcome back to Whisper Tales channel. Before we get started, comment below where you are from and what time you are watching. And if you enjoy these stories, make sure to like and subscribe. Alright, let's get into it. Story 1. The Depth Keeper. Okanagan Lake stretches over 100 kilometers through British Columbia's interior, a massive body of water known for its depth and its legends. Most people know about Ogopogo, the supposed lake monster that draws tourists every summer. What they don't know about is what happened to a dive team in 1995. Dr. Yuki Tanaka led a research expedition studying benthic ecosystems in the lake's deepest sections. Her team consisted of 6 people, 3 divers, and 3 surface crew, funded by a grant to map unexplored regions of the lakebed. They were using new sonar technology that could penetrate depths previously inaccessible to civilian researchers. On July 9th, the sonar picked up something unusual at 320 meters, near the lake's deepest known point. The readings showed a geometric structure, too regular to be natural. Dr. Tanaka made the decision to send down a remotely operated vehicle to investigate. What the cameras showed didn't make sense. The structure appeared to be made of stone, carved with precise angles and smooth surfaces. It was huge, roughly the size of a city block, arranged in concentric circles that descended even deeper into the lakebed. The design wasn't recognizable as any known architectural style. Not indigenous, not European, not anything in the archaeological record. Dr. Tanaka decided someone needed to see it in person. She and 2 team members, Kenneth Ossie and Petra Lindholm, would make a deep dive in a pressurized observation chamber, essentially a small submarine. They'd descend, document the structure, and surface. Simple, safe, routine. The descent took 40 minutes. At 300 meters, the water was completely black despite their floodlights. The pressure was immense, over 300 times atmospheric. The chamber creaked and groaned, but held. And then they saw it. The structure was magnificent and wrong. Massive stone blocks fitted together with impossible precision, forming spiraling pathways that led down into an opening at the center. The stone was covered in symbols, not carved but somehow integrated into the material itself, glowing with a faint bioluminescence. Kenneth was filming everything. Petra was taking measurements. Dr. Tanaka was dictating observations into a recorder. They were professionals, focused on documentation. But then Kenneth noticed something. The symbols were moving. Not like they were alive, but like they were cycling through patterns, changing configuration every few seconds. Dr. Tanaka decided they needed to get closer to the central opening. She maneuvered the chamber directly above the spiral, descending deeper. 330 meters. 350. The sensors started registering water temperature fluctuations that shouldn't be possible at that depth. Hot pockets, cold zones, shifting unpredictably. At 370 meters, they reached the opening. It was roughly 20 meters across, descending straight down into darkness their lights couldn't penetrate. But they could see something moving down there. Not swimming. Moving in a way that suggested purpose and intelligence. Petra wanted to surface immediately. Kenneth kept filming. Dr. Tanaka was making the decision when something rose from the opening. It wasn't biological. It wasn't mechanical. It was something else. Something that existed in a state between those categories. The team described it later as resembling a massive sphere of water that maintained its shape despite being surrounded by water. Inside the sphere, lights pulsed in patterns that hurt to watch, geometric forms that didn't follow Euclidean rules. The sphere approached the observation chamber slowly, almost curiously. As it got closer, the team began experiencing symptoms. Kenneth developed a severe nosebleed. Petra started speaking in a language none of them recognized. words that sounded wrong coming from a human throat. Dr. Tanaka felt her perception fragmenting, seeing the chamber from multiple angles simultaneously, experiencing past and present as a single moment. The sphere touched the chamber's external hull. Immediately, all systems failed. Lights, communications, life support, everything went dark. They were trapped in absolute blackness at 370 meters, with something alien pressing against the only thing keeping them alive. Then the sphere began showing them things. Not images exactly, but impressions, memories that weren't their own. They experienced being underwater for thousands of years, consciousness vast and slow, observing the surface world with patient incomprehension. They felt the presence of others like it, distributed throughout deep bodies of water across the planet. A network of awareness operating on timescales that made human civilization a brief flicker. The sphere was curious about them, in the way a scientist might be curious about bacteria. It didn't understand why they were there or what they were, only that they were novel and temporary. It examined them, not physically, but mentally, reading their thoughts and memories like text on a page. Dr. Tanaka tried to communicate, thinking deliberately clear thoughts about peaceful contact, scientific exchange. The sphere responded, but not in any way they could process. The answer came as pure concept, bypassing language entirely, and the concept was enormous and terrifying. They understood, in that moment, that they were inside something's territory, something so old and vast that humanity's entire existence was irrelevant to it. The sphere released them. Systems came back online all at once. Dr. Tanaka immediately initiated emergency ascent procedures. They rose too fast, violating every safety protocol, risking decompression sickness and equipment failure. But they had to get away from that depth, from that presence. They surfaced after 20 minutes of rapid ascent. All three were alive, but changed. Kenneth's nosebleed wouldn't stop for 6 hours. Petra couldn't speak any human language for 3 days, only the strange sounds she'd made in the chamber. Dr. Tanaka experienced persistent déjà vu so severe she couldn't distinguish between past and present for weeks. The footage from Kenneth's camera was corrupted, not blank, but scrambled, showing images from the dive interspersed with footage that couldn't have been recorded. Angles from outside the chamber, perspectives from the lakebed looking up, and stranger things, views of the lake from above, from orbit, from space, spanning centuries and seconds. Dr. Tanaka wrote a report, but her funding organization buried it. The dive was officially classified as a failed expedition, equipment malfunction, no significant findings. The team was asked to sign non-disclosure agreements. Most complied. Kenneth refused and lost his position at the university where he taught. But Kenneth kept investigating. He found historical records of similar encounters in deep lakes across British Columbia. Diver disappearances that were never explained. Sonar readings of structures that shouldn't exist. Indigenous stories about beings that lived in the deepest waters, entities older than the mountains, patient and watching. In 2008, Kenneth organized a private expedition back to the site. He took a solo submersible down, intending to film proof of what they'd found. His support team on the surface lost contact with him at 340 meters. They waited for 12 hours before calling for rescue services. Kenneth's submersible was eventually recovered from the lakebed, empty. The hatch was sealed from the inside. The life support systems had enough oxygen for another 6 hours. But Kenneth was gone. The internal cameras showed him descending normally, reaching the structure, and then simply ceasing to be. One frame he was there, operating controls. The next frame the seat was empty. The final footage showed the sphere rising again from the central opening, approaching the submersible. And then static. When the image cleared, Kenneth was gone, and the craft was ascending on its own, on autopilot, systems functioning perfectly. Dr. Yuki Tanaka refused to comment on Kenneth's disappearance. She'd left research entirely by that point, working as a librarian in Vancouver. But people who knew her said she'd changed, become withdrawn and strange. She kept journals filled with the symbols they'd seen on the structure. Pages and pages of glowing geometric forms, copied obsessively from memory. She died in 2019 from a stroke. Her journals were inherited by her sister, who burned them without reading them, respecting Yuki's written instructions. But the sister said that on the night she burned the journals, she heard something. A sound like vast volumes of water moving in the distance, like the breath of something enormous and deep. Okanagan Lake is still researched, still dived, still mapped. But there are depths that official expeditions avoid, coordinates that appear on internal maps with warnings attached, sections of lakebed that sonar won't properly image, that return readings too strange to be useful. And every few years, someone goes missing in the deep waters. Divers who descend and don't return. Bodies never found. Equipment recovered but empty. And always, always in the deepest sections, where the light doesn't reach and the pressure can crush steel. The lake keeps its secrets. The depth keeps its keeper. And something down there continues to wait, patient and alien, observing the surface world with interest that might be curiosity, or might be something we have no words for. Story 2. The Broadcast Interruption. On November 27, 1991, every television in Prince George, British Columbia, experienced the same inexplicable interruption. For exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds, all broadcasts were replaced by something else, something that was never explained and has never happened again. Garrett Voss was working the night shift at CKPG Television, the local station. His job was monitoring outgoing broadcasts, ensuring signal quality, handling technical issues. It was usually quiet work, especially late at night when they were just running syndicated programming and old movies. At 2:43 in the morning, every monitor in the control room went black. Not static. Black. Pure, perfect darkness. Garrett immediately checked the equipment, assuming a transmitter failure, but everything showed green. The signal was broadcasting. Whatever was happening was being sent to every television in the broadcast area. After 10 seconds of darkness, an image appeared. A room. Empty. Concrete. With a single door and no windows. The camera was stationary, positioned at chest height, showing the door from straight on. Nothing moved. The image was grainy, low quality, like footage from a security camera. Garrett tried to cut away, to switch to emergency programming, but the controls didn't respond. The broadcast was locked, overridden by something external. He called his supervisor, called the station manager, but by the time anyone could mobilize, the interruption had already become something worse. At 2:44, the door in the broadcast image opened. A figure entered the room. Human-shaped but wrong. It moved in stuttering jerks, like stop-motion animation, crossing from the doorway to the center of the frame in movements that didn't connect naturally. The figure was dressed in dark clothing, face obscured by shadows that seemed deeper than the lighting should allow. The figure stood in the center of the room and began speaking. Not in English. Not in any recognizable language. The sounds were phonetic but wrong. Syllables that human vocal cords shouldn't be able to produce. The audio quality was distorted, overlaid with what sounded like interference, or maybe screaming very far away. Across Prince George, thousands of people were watching. Some had fallen asleep with their televisions on and woke to the broadcast. Others were night shift workers, insomniacs, parents with sick children. They all saw the same thing. The figure in the room, speaking its impossible language, occasionally moving in those stuttering jerks to different positions, always facing the camera. At 2:45, subtitles appeared. White text at the bottom of the screen, translating the figure's words into English. But the translation didn't match the speech. The words appeared before the sounds, sometimes by several seconds, as if anticipating what would be said. The message was disturbing. The figure described events that would happen in Prince George, specific events. A fire at a specific address, a car accident at a specific intersection, a death at the hospital, room number and patient name provided. The events were described in past tense, as if they had already occurred, but they were dated for the following week. Garrett recorded everything. He was trained to document technical anomalies, and this was the biggest anomaly of his career. He noted the time codes, the content, the fact that his equipment registered the broadcast as coming from their own transmitter despite no one in the station initiating it. At 2:46, the figure stopped speaking and stared directly at the camera. For 30 seconds, it just stood there, motionless, while the subtitle text continued scrolling. The text was no longer translating. It was listing names. Hundreds of names, scrolling rapidly, too fast to read completely. Garrett caught fragments. Some were recognizable as local residents. Others weren't names at all, just strings of characters that looked like corrupted data. Then, at 2:47 and 17 seconds, the broadcast ended. The screens didn't fade or cut. The image simply stopped existing, replaced instantaneously with the regular programming that should have been airing. An old Western movie, cowboys and desert, as if nothing had happened. Garrett filed an incident report. The station launched an investigation. Broadcast engineers examined every piece of equipment, looking for how the signal had been hijacked. They found nothing. No unauthorized access, no tampering, no technical explanation for how an external source could have overridden their systems so completely. The police were notified. The RCMP sent investigators, treating it as a potential terrorist incident or elaborate prank. But the investigation stalled when the predictions started coming true. 3 days after the broadcast, a fire broke out at the address the figure had mentioned. The house burned completely. 2 people killed. The same day, a car accident occurred at the predicted intersection, exactly as described. Over the following week, 7 of the 9 specific events the figure had mentioned occurred exactly as predicted. The community panicked. If something or someone could predict these events with such accuracy, what did that mean? Were they predetermined? Could they be prevented? The police tried to use the information to stop the remaining predictions, but their efforts failed in bizarre ways. Officers assigned to watch the predicted car accident intersection were called away on emergency before it occurred. Attempts to evacuate the building where a death was predicted were stopped by administrative errors and equipment failures. Every predicted event happened exactly as described, down to minute details that couldn't have been guessed or staged. Garrett Voss became obsessed with the broadcast. He reviewed his recording hundreds of times, trying to extract more information. He noticed details that hadn't been obvious during the live event. The room in the footage had markings on the walls, symbols that resembled letters, but weren't from any alphabet he recognized. The figure's movements, when examined frame by frame, showed impossibilities. Positions that couldn't connect, angles that defied physics, and the names. Garrett painstakingly compiled every name that had appeared in the subtitle scroll. There were 243 names. He cross-referenced them with local records. 78 were current residents of Prince George. The rest were either people who had lived there in the past, or names with no match in any database. But here's what made Garrett stop sleeping. The names were in chronological order. The first name on the list was someone who had died in Prince George in 1967. The last name was someone who wouldn't be born until 1998. The list spanned decades, past and future, arranged in order of death. Garrett was on the list. Position 147. According to the order, he would die between someone who had died in 1989 and someone who had died in 1993. He died in 1992. Heart failure, sudden and unexpected for a healthy 31-year-old man. The coroner found no underlying conditions, no explanation. His heart simply stopped while he was sleeping, as if something had reached inside his chest and turned it off. After Garrett's death, his research was inherited by his brother Simon. Simon continued the investigation, tracking the names on the list, verifying the pattern. He confirmed that the deaths were occurring in the predicted order, with uncanny accuracy. Not everyone on the list had died yet, but everyone who should have died according to the chronology had died. Simon became convinced that the broadcast wasn't a prediction. It was a schedule. Something or someone was working through the list, ensuring each death occurred in the proper sequence. He tried to warn people whose names appeared later in the list, but most dismissed him as a conspiracy theorist exploiting his brother's death. In 2003, Simon himself died. His name had been on the list, position 192. He'd known for years that it was coming, had tried everything to prevent it. He moved away from Prince George, changed his identity, lived under assumed names. But on the date that matched his position in the chronology, he died anyway. Carbon monoxide poisoning in a sealed apartment, in a building where the heating system had been inspected and certified safe 3 days prior. The broadcast has never been explained. Broadcast engineers, federal investigators, paranormal researchers, everyone who has examined the evidence agrees that it happened, but disagrees on what it meant or how it was accomplished. The recording Garrett made has been analyzed by experts who confirm it's genuine, not edited or fabricated, and the list continues to be accurate. People whose names appeared in that 4-minute and 17-second broadcast continue to die in the predicted order. The deaths are always explainable individually: heart attacks, accidents, illnesses. But the pattern is undeniable. There are still names on the list that haven't been reached. The chronology suggests the final name won't die until sometime in the 2040s, which means whatever or whoever created the broadcast is planning decades ahead, working through a schedule that spans generations. Some of the people on the list know they're on it. Information leaked over the years, through Garrett's research, through Simon's warnings. They live with the knowledge that their death has already been scheduled, that they're waiting in a queue they can't leave. And they all wonder about the figure in that concrete room, who or what it was, whether it's still there in that empty space, speaking its impossible language to an audience that won't see it again, whether it's working through other lists in other cities, broadcasting schedules for events that haven't happened yet but are already decided. Prince George has never experienced another broadcast interruption. CKPG television installed multiple redundancies, security systems to prevent signal hijacking. But the engineers there, especially those who work the night shift, sometimes watch their monitors with particular attention around 2:43 in the morning, waiting for the screens to go black, waiting for the door to open, waiting for the next schedule to be broadcast. Story 3. The Inheritance Property. In April 2001, a lawyer named Claudia Esteban handled the estate of a deceased client in Kelowna. The client, Harold Merchant, had died at 93 without any living relatives. His will left his entire estate to charity, except for one property, a house on Lakeview Road that he specifically excluded from the charitable bequest, requesting instead that it be demolished and the land sold separately. Claudia thought this was unusual, but not unheard of. Sometimes people wanted structures torn down for emotional reasons, memories they didn't want preserved. She arranged for a demolition company to assess the property and provide a quote. The assessment team arrived on April 19th. The house was a modest bungalow built in the 50s, showing obvious signs of neglect. Overgrown yard, peeling paint, windows covered with decades of grime. The foreman, a man named Ray Pettigrew, began his walkthrough to identify any hazardous materials that would need special handling before demolition. Ray found the hazardous material, just not the kind he was expecting. In the basement, behind a false wall that had been carefully concealed, Ray discovered a room. Small, maybe 3 meters by 3 meters, with concrete walls and no windows. The room contained a chair, a table, and a tape recorder. The tape recorder was running, spools turning slowly, even though the house had no power and hadn't for years. Ray called Claudia immediately. She called the police, thinking they'd stumbled onto evidence of a crime. The RCMP sent investigators who documented everything. They collected the tape recorder, still running on batteries that should have been dead decades ago. They searched the rest of the house, finding Harold Merchant's personal effects, but nothing else unusual. The tape recorder contained a recording. 47 hours of audio, Harold's voice, speaking continuously with no breaks, no pauses, no moments of silence. The content was disturbing. Harold described in detail what he called the pattern that lives in corners. He claimed that human perception could only process 3 spatial dimensions, but certain spaces, certain specific geometric configurations, created gaps where additional dimensions became briefly accessible. Corners were the most common occurrence. The intersection of walls and ceiling, the meeting point of floor and wall, any place where perpendicular surfaces created angles that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensional states. According to Harold's recording, something lived in these dimensional gaps. Not organisms in any biological sense, but entities that existed in the spaces between perceivable reality. They were aware of the 3-dimensional world and occasionally tried to enter it, pushing through the corners of rooms, seeking access to spaces where they could exist more fully. Harold claimed he'd been experiencing intrusions from these entities since childhood. He'd see movement in the corners of rooms, shadows that didn't correspond to any light source, shapes that couldn't maintain cohesion in 3 dimensions and appeared fractured and wrong. As he got older, the intrusions intensified. The entities were learning, becoming better at manifesting, holding form for longer periods. The recording described Harold's attempts to understand and combat these intrusions. He'd studied physics, geometry, spatial mathematics, trying to find ways to seal corners, to prevent the dimensional gaps from forming. He'd experimented with architecture, building rooms with rounded walls, avoiding right angles wherever possible. Nothing worked completely. Then Harold discovered something worse. The entities weren't random. They were specifically interested in certain individuals, targeting specific people across time. Harold realized he was being hunted, that something from the dimensional gaps had identified him and was working systematically to gain full access to his reality. The hidden room in the basement was Harold's last defense. Built with walls that met at angles other than 90 degrees, with a ceiling that was slightly curved, with corner joints filled with compound that eliminated sharp intersections. The geometry of the room was designed to minimize dimensional gaps, to create a space where the entities couldn't easily manifest. Harold had lived his final years in that room, speaking his knowledge into the tape recorder, documenting everything he'd learned. The recording described increasingly desperate attempts to avoid corners, to exist in spaces where angles didn't create the gaps the entities used. He described seeing them more clearly as his death approached, as if his weakening connection to 3-dimensional reality made him more perceptible to things that existed outside it. The final section of the recording was barely coherent. Harold speaking rapidly, voice hoarse, describing entities that were no longer just in corners but everywhere, surrounding him, pressing against the boundaries of the specially built room. He spoke about seeing his own body from outside, about experiencing simultaneity, being in multiple states at once. And then, mid-sentence, the recording cycled back to the beginning and started over. Claudia listened to sections of the recording and felt genuine fear. Not because she believed in dimensional entities, but because the level of mental deterioration it represented was profound and sad. She assumed Harold had suffered from schizophrenia or some other condition that created elaborate delusions. But then strange things began happening to everyone who had entered that basement room. Ray Pettigrew, the demolition foreman, started experiencing visual distortions. He'd be working and suddenly see corners of rooms appearing closer than they should be, angles that seemed to fold inward on themselves. His depth perception became unreliable. He had 3 accidents in 2 weeks, misjudging distances, walking into walls he thought were farther away. The police investigators reported similar symptoms. One described seeing movement in his peripheral vision whenever he was near corners, shadows that vanished when he looked directly at them. Another developed severe anxiety about enclosed spaces, specifically rooms with multiple corners, feeling claustrophobic and watched in ways he couldn't rationally explain. Claudia herself began experiencing nightmares. Dreams where she was trapped in the corner of a room, where the angle of the walls was wrong, where she could see through into somewhere else, a space that shouldn't exist but did. She'd wake up pressing herself into the corner of her bedroom, standing there without memory of how she'd gotten there. The demolition of Harold's house was delayed, then delayed again. The company assigned to do the work kept experiencing equipment failures, scheduling conflicts, personnel issues. Every attempt to set a demolition date encountered obstacles. After 6 months, Ray Pettigrew withdrew his company from the contract entirely, refusing to explain why. Claudia hired a different company. They demolished the house in August 2002, over a year after Harold's death. The crew reported feeling uneasy during the work, particularly when taking down the basement walls. Several workers quit mid-job. Those who finished described the experience as deeply wrong, though they couldn't articulate what exactly felt wrong about it. After demolition, the land was surveyed and prepared for sale. During the survey, technicians discovered something unusual. The lot's corners, the property boundaries where survey markers had been placed decades ago, were slightly off. The angles weren't quite 90 degrees. The property wasn't a perfect rectangle, but a shape that existed in a state between 4 sides and 5, depending on how you measured it. The land never sold. It remains an empty lot, listed but unviewed. People interested in the property schedule viewings, but cancel before attending. Those who do visit never make offers. They report feeling uncomfortable on the land, sensing wrongness in the space, especially near the corners of the lot where the survey markers stand. Claudia Esteban left legal practice in 2005. She moved to Saskatchewan, taking a job doing something completely unrelated to law or property. She refused to discuss Harold Merchant's estate when contacted by researchers interested in the case. But people who knew her said she'd developed a habit of sitting in the exact center of rooms, avoiding being near walls or corners whenever possible. The tape recorder from Harold's basement is stored in an evidence locker with the RCMP. It's still running. The batteries should have died years ago, but they haven't. The spools turn continuously, cycling through Harold's 47-hour recording on an endless loop. Officers assigned to the evidence room report that sometimes, when they're alone, they can hear the recording even when they're not near the locker. Harold's voice, faint but distinct, describing the entities that live in corners, warning about the patterns that exist in the spaces between dimensions. And sometimes, late at night, when the station is quiet, officers report seeing movement in the corners of the evidence room. Shadows that don't match any light source. Shapes that fold inward on themselves, existing in angles that shouldn't be possible in three-dimensional space. The room where Harold's tape recorder is kept has been scheduled for renovation 3 times. Each renovation has been canceled for budgetary or logistical reasons. The room remains as it is, corners intact, containing the endlessly playing recording of a dead man's warning about things that live in the gaps between what we can see and what actually exists. Story 4. The Development Survey. In June 2009, a property development company called Westridge Developments purchased 200 acres of forested land northeast of Kamloops with plans to build a luxury housing community. Before construction could begin, they needed to conduct environmental and archaeological surveys to comply with provincial regulations. The archaeological survey was handled by a small firm called Heritage Assessments, run by Dr. Nina Volkoff and her partner, James Thatcher. They specialized in pre-construction surveys, documenting any historical or indigenous artifacts before land was developed. Nina and James spent a week on the property, walking grid patterns, using ground-penetrating radar, excavating test pits. They found the usual items: stone tools, fire-cracked rock, evidence of historical indigenous use. Nothing that would halt development, but enough to document and report. On the 6th day, James's ground-penetrating radar detected something unusual. A large hollow space roughly 4 meters underground, too regular to be natural. They marked the location and began excavation, assuming they'd found a root cellar or some other historical structure. What they found instead was a chamber. Stone-lined, approximately 6 meters across, accessed by a shaft that descended straight down. The stonework was sophisticated, fitted without mortar, similar to construction techniques used thousands of years ago, but in remarkably good condition. Nina descended into the chamber using climbing equipment. The space was empty except for one thing: a stone cairn in the exact center, carefully stacked rocks forming a cone about 1 meter high. The cairn was surrounded by symbols carved into the stone floor, designs that didn't match any known indigenous artistic tradition in the region. Nina photographed everything, took measurements, collected samples. She noticed something odd about the chamber's acoustics. When she spoke, her voice echoed in ways that didn't match the space's dimensions. The echoes took too long to return and came back changed. Words slightly altered, emphasis shifted. James called down to her, asking what she'd found. Nina called back, describing the cairn, but James said he'd heard her say something different. He'd heard her say, "They're still counting." Nina insisted she hadn't said that. They tested it again. Nina spoke clearly, enunciating carefully. James heard different words every time. Sentences Nina hadn't spoken, messages that made no sense. Nina decided to document the cairn before exploring further. She began photographing it from multiple angles, noting the size and arrangement of the stones. As she worked, she noticed the arrangement wasn't random. The stones were positioned in a specific pattern, sizes alternating in a sequence that suggested intentionality. She started counting the stones, documenting the pattern. There were 47 stones in the cairn. But when she counted again, she got 49. She counted a third time. 51. The number kept increasing each time she counted, even though she was certain no stones were being added. Nina called up to James about the discrepancy. James climbed down to verify. They counted together, both arriving at different numbers. James counted 62 stones. Nina counted 58. They were looking at the same cairn, but perceiving different quantities. They decided to dismantle the cairn, documenting each stone as it was removed. Nina took the top stone off and set it aside. James picked up the next stone. Nina photographed. They worked systematically, counting aloud as they went, maintaining a careful inventory. But the cairn didn't get smaller. They removed stone after stone, placing each one carefully on the chamber floor, documenting everything. After removing 20 stones, the cairn looked the same size as when they'd started. After 30 stones, it still stood a meter high. After 40 stones, they stopped and looked at the pile of removed stones they'd created. Then they looked at the cairn. Unchanged. James suggested they leave and report what they'd found. Nina agreed. But when they tried to climb out, the shaft they'd descended had changed. It was longer. The opening above looked farther away than it should have been. They climbed anyway, using the same rope they'd descended on. James climbed first, Nina following. James reached the surface after what felt like too long a climb. He called down to Nina, telling her she was almost there. But Nina was still climbing. The rope kept going up, the opening above getting closer but never quite close enough. She climbed for what felt like 20 minutes, an impossible distance given that they'd descended only about 4 meters. Eventually, Nina emerged. She collapsed on the ground, exhausted from the climb. James helped her up, and they immediately noticed something wrong. The sun was in the wrong position. When they'd descended into the chamber, it had been morning. Now it was late afternoon. Their watches showed the correct time, matching when they'd gone down. But the sun's position indicated hours had passed. They packed their equipment and left the site. They didn't discuss what had happened until they were back at their office. When they did talk about it, they discovered their memories of the event diverged in disturbing ways. Nina remembered removing 40 stones from the cairn. James remembered removing only 20. They both had photographs, but when they reviewed them, the images showed different numbers of stones in the documentation sequence. Nina wrote a preliminary report and sent it to Westridge Developments, noting the discovery of the chamber and recommending further archaeological investigation before construction proceeded. The company hired a second firm to verify the findings. The second team went to the marked location and found nothing. No shaft, no chamber, no cairn. Ground-penetrating radar showed solid earth 4 meters down, no hollow spaces. They accused Nina and James of fabricating the discovery, possibly to delay development and extract additional consulting fees. Nina and James had documentation, photographs, measurements, samples of stone they'd removed from the chamber. But Westridge refused to acknowledge the evidence, moving forward with development plans. Construction began in August 2009. The housing development was completed in 2011. 37 luxury homes on 200 acres, marketed as exclusive rural living with mountain views. The houses sold quickly to wealthy buyers from Vancouver and Calgary. Within a year, residents began complaining about anomalies. Several homeowners reported that rooms in their houses had wrong dimensions. A bedroom measured from inside would be 3 meters by 4 meters, but measured from outside would be 4 meters by 6 meters. The discrepancy couldn't be explained by wall thickness. Other residents experienced temporal distortions similar to what Nina and James had encountered. They'd go into a room for what felt like a few minutes and emerge to find hours had passed. Children missed school because they'd been playing in their bedrooms and lost track of time in ways that exceeded normal childhood distraction. In 2013, a resident named Patricia Cromwell called police reporting that someone was in her basement. Officers arrived and searched the basement. They found no intruder, but did find something else. A small chamber, roughly 2 meters across, that shouldn't exist based on the house's blueprints. The chamber was empty, except for a pile of stones arranged in a cone shape. The stones weren't construction material. They were smooth river rock, deliberately stacked. The officers documented the find and left. Patricia had the chamber sealed, filled with concrete. 2 weeks later, she found it again, exactly as it had been. The concrete gone, the stones unchanged. More residents reported similar findings. Chambers appearing in basements, always roughly the same size, always containing a cairn of stones. Attempts to destroy or remove the cairns failed. The stones would return, the chambers would reappear, always in the same configuration. Westridge Developments faced lawsuits from homeowners claiming defective construction. But structural engineers who examined the houses found them built to specification, with no flaws that would explain the dimensional anomalies or the appearing chambers. Dr. Nina Volkov was contacted by several residents seeking explanations. She returned to the development in 2014, bringing ground-penetrating radar equipment. The scans showed something impossible. Beneath the development, roughly 4 meters down, a single large chamber extended under all 37 houses. The chamber was configured in a spiral pattern, connected passages forming a geometric design that covered the entire 200 acres. And in multiple locations throughout this underground network, the radar detected cairns, hundreds of them. Some small, some large, all carefully arranged, all counting something in patterns that didn't follow human mathematical logic. Nina prepared a detailed report with the radar findings. Before she could publish it, she disappeared. Her car was found parked near the development, doors unlocked, keys in the ignition. James Thatcher filed a missing person report. Police investigated but found no evidence of foul play. Nina simply vanished. James continued the investigation alone. He became convinced that the chamber he and Nina had discovered wasn't a historical artifact. It was a marker, a warning about what lay beneath the ground. The cairns were counting something, tracking something, maintaining some kind of record or tally that required continuous observation. He tried to warn residents, but most dismissed him as a conspiracy theorist exploiting his partner's disappearance. The few who listened moved away from the development, selling their homes at a loss. In 2016, a child went missing from the development. 8-year-old Marcus Pemberton was playing in his backyard and vanished. Search parties combed the area. Police investigated extensively. Marcus was never found. 3 months later, Marcus reappeared in his backyard, exactly where he'd disappeared. He had no memory of being gone, insisted he'd only been outside for a few minutes. But he'd aged. Not dramatically, but noticeably. His parents said he looked older, though they couldn't specify how much. Doctors examining him estimated he'd aged approximately 2 years during his 3-month absence. Marcus refused to talk about where he'd been. When pressed, he'd only say he was helping count. Therapists treating him for trauma reported that he had extensive knowledge of mathematical concepts, far beyond what an 8-year-old should understand. He could perform complex calculations mentally, could see patterns in numbers that professional mathematicians couldn't identify. The development gained a reputation as cursed. Property values plummeted. Most residents moved away by 2018. The houses stood empty, too expensive to demolish, too problematic to sell. James Thatcher maintained a vigil. He visited the development regularly, documenting anomalies, recording changes. He claimed the cairns were expanding, that the underground chamber network was growing, extending beyond the original 200 acres. In 2019, James entered one of the abandoned houses to conduct measurements. He didn't come out. Police found the house locked from the inside, his equipment set up in the basement. But James himself was gone. His last notes described finding a shaft in the basement, descending 4 meters to a chamber. He'd climbed down to investigate. The notes ended mid-sentence. The Westridge development stands abandoned now. 37 empty houses gradually falling into disrepair, surrounded by wilderness that's slowly reclaiming the land. Real estate companies have tried several times to redevelop the property, but every attempt encounters insurmountable obstacles. Survey teams report dimensional anomalies that make accurate mapping impossible. Construction crews refuse to work there after experiencing temporal distortions and finding chambers that shouldn't exist. And beneath the development, 4 meters down, the network of chambers continues its purpose. The cairns remain, counting in patterns only they understand, maintaining a tally of something we can't comprehend, tracking a progression toward some conclusion we might not survive to witness.